Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm your speaker, Casey, and in part 1, Daniel O'Brien and I discussed how Daniel became a part of the organisation. And in this part, we will be looking at the consequences of being shunned, with part 3 focusing on rebuilding an entire life outside of the Jehovah's Witnesses. For early access to full-length, ad-free content, please visit patreon.com/the Cult Vault and sign up for as little as £1 a month. But for now, here is Daniel. What you said there was really interesting as well, around having some authentic part of yourself from a long time ago to draw on, which of course Jehovah's Witnesses, now being an established organization, there are fourth, fifth generation individuals born into this group who unfortunately are born without that opportunity. And that's really where the shunning policy can leave somebody totally isolated without any real idea of where they would begin to carve out a part of life for themselves that's separate to the organization. And I imagine that really doing the work is significantly more difficult. Well, actually, no, not more difficult, is significantly difficult for a person born and raised in a group. But that
Right.
doesn't diminish at all what individuals lose when they leave the organization, whether it's willingly or unwillingly, because of course you yourself have lost a significant amount of precious things in your departure from the organization, which you were a part of for over 2 decades.
That's right. That's right. And I have a couple of young friends who were raised as witnesses, who have left the organization. I just mentioned one. He lives here locally. Another one is a young man in Indiana and they're both like sons to me. They can never replace the loss from my actual sons, and I can never replace the loss from their actual fathers. But we've at least fill that void partially. And so it is interesting to talk to them about the fact that they were raised as witnesses. They had to figure out their authentic self much differently. That it was like, well, who would I maybe be if I had never been raised in this group? Which is obviously a completely hypothetical question, but they both have become very successful. One's an engineer working on cold fusion, and this is not fantasy. He was at Lawrence Livermore last week or the week before. I mean, they're totally seriously pursuing this as a reality to try and to deal with the energy issues that we face as humanity. The other is a very successful businessman in the food industry, as a beautiful wife and family. And these are the kind of people that if you didn't know they were ever in a cult and you met them, you would think, my goodness, these are totally good people. These are solid citizens. They're like model human beings. And yet their parents will not talk to them because they don't go to the Kingdom Hall and profess to believe in a fantasy God. And it's heartbreaking for both of them to deal with that. And most of the time they seem fine. If you just met them, you would never know until they open up and you have moments of vulnerable conversations.
When you became an elder and you held that position for a number of years, do you remember being given your special copy of this secret book?
Oh yeah. And I've always tried to be self-reflective about this, but in moments of brutal honesty, it goes to your head.
It's designed to.
Yeah, it's designed to.
And it creates that power dynamic and that elitist mentality, but also you having this hidden knowledge, it almost creates that omnipotent feeling between those that lead the congregation and those that attend the congregation.
I'm not sure what the question is in there.
I think it's more just my waffling observations on congregants really not questioning the knowledge of the elders. They have the answers to all of these things. They know God's way. They know Jehovah's wishes and the way that things should be done through that little trickle down system of those guys at the very, very top of the pyramid. And I think it really not only makes, perhaps as you've described, elders feel elevated above the congregants, but also makes the congregants feel like you're rightfully placed on those pedestals almost, because you have all of this hidden knowledge.
Well, yeah, and so the idea of hidden knowledge is interesting. That's not really a term that witnesses would use so much. And again, there's this, like a lot of cults, there's the public persona, and then there's the private one, and what the reality of things. So I think the average witness does know that there are things that elders and others are privy to, but it's not like a secret society like Masons or something like that. As at least as far as I know, there aren't any rituals or anything, but I was never elevated to the ranks of the governing body. But as far as I can tell, at least the current governing body, they are complete fools they inherited a hierarchy and a power structure, and they just don't have an original thought among them. That's getting off on another tangent. But there's like these practices and policies in place, and it's self-perpetuating. It's like a ship that's on autopilot, so to speak. But in that secret elders manual, which interestingly, even though I've been out of the organization for over a decade now, I'm in communication with a lot of other ex-witnesses, and there always have been people who at the headquarters who are willing to leak this stuff. And I routinely get digital copies of the latest issue of that secret elders manual. And I'm not doing anything with it, but for probably this small part of me that's not the best part of me, it feels kind of good to still be able to, as a person who's not even in the organization, still be able to get copies of something I'm not supposed to have just because I'm not supposed to have it. By the way, so I was disfellowshipped in 2009, but I was reinstated 4 years later. It took 4 long years. And that was an interesting thing. I did it only because I wanted to try and reconcile with my sons. It ultimately was completely futile, and it didn't work at all. And it was very difficult because I didn't believe it anymore. So for 4 long years, I went to all the meetings. I pretended to believe what I no longer believed. I was very careful with what I said. And it's interesting. I got to the point where I realized I could say things that were true, but would not be what the elders who were interviewing me would understand it to mean. And it became like a game to me. But so I am technically, officially one of Jehovah's Witnesses in good standing, which is an ironic thing. But I haven't been to a meeting since 2013 or something like that.
It feels like you're almost doing what the organization is doing, but back to the organization. It's like I'm sure there's probably films about this sort of thing, like Ocean's 11 or something like that, where you're actually playing they're playing your game, you're not playing theirs, which is a really interesting concept.
Yeah. So when I would sit there in the meetings and it was painful, I would highlight things that were logical fallacies or inconsistencies or contradictions. And again, the appearance of education. So when I was in one of these judicial hearings to see if I could get reinstated, one of the elders said, as he was walking up and down the aisles during the meetings, he noticed that I really studied well, again, scare quotes for people that can't see it, because I used 3 or 4 different color highlighters, and I had pens and pencils, and I would write notes in it. And sometimes my wife, who's Hungarian, would come with me, and we would write notes to each other in Hungarian, so they couldn't read what I was writing. But this elder said, "Wow, you really study well." And I just said, "Thank you." What he didn't realize is I was pointing all all the things that proved this religion was bullshit. And how did I believe this for so long? But that was a very painful thing to do, and it didn't work anyway. So I would not recommend to anybody to do that. But so many strange things happened during this period of time. While I was disfellowshipped, and participating in a community of ex-witnesses who were trying to figure out life after a cult, and that's an interesting thing by itself. There was this one young woman who didn't believe it, but wanted to get reinstated so she could reconnect with her family. I wrote for her reinstatement letter, and she got reinstated. So I was disfellowshipped, and I wrote her reinstatement letter, and she got reinstated. And it was things like that where, like, the Holy Spirit either doesn't exist or doesn't care. I've concluded it doesn't exist.
I was talking to Natalie Grand a few weeks ago, and she mentioned that her grandfather was an elder. And when she was disfellowshipped and wanted to be reinstated, he coached her on what to say to become reinstated. And I think that again is just another thing that shows you that it's not divine intervention, it's
No.
man-made fallacy.
Well, this goes back to the thing about they pretend that the Holy Spirit is involved with this and all these things, and some of them maybe believe it. I somebody asked me once if I ever believed any of this, and I said, that's a great question. I don't think I ever did, but I wanted to. I wanted those things, as I said at the outset. The idea that there was a God who cared, and he cared about humans in general, and me in particular, and that there was going to be an end to crime and war, and even maybe death would be done away with, and we would have this international brotherhood of those things. I believed in. I still believe them. I don't think they're ever going to happen, unfortunately, but those are attractive to me. But as far as the core doctrines, I don't think I ever believed it. I wanted to. I totally seriously studied the Bible and read it in detail, and I had a lot of questions, and the witness that when I first started, again, scare quote studying, I would ask him really hard questions, and he would say, "That's a great question. Don't worry, you'll get the answer." Well, after 20-ish years of being in the organization and I can't get the answers, I started to realize there aren't any. If I can't find them in all the society's publications, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, there aren't answers. That was just another vague, distracting bullshit technique to keep people sucked in. Oh, you'll find out, and there's nothing to find out. There's no there. And so going back on the thing you said, I had been disfellowshipped by one congregation, and I had been attending another, and that was a technique I knew to both frustrate the situation, but it was a two-edged sword. It made it more difficult for me. When someone wants to get reinstated, both congregations have to agree. Well, the average person wouldn't know this, but since I had been an elder, I did. Twice the congregation I was going to recommended I get reinstated, but the congregation that disfellowships a person has to approve it, and twice they turned it down. Well, it doesn't take much thinking to realize, if Holy Spirit's really involved, how come Holy Spirit can tell one congregation yes and the other congregation no? It's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. It's all just humans. And there was one elder in particular in the first congregation who just didn't like me. And it was as simple as that. One time in a conversation, the three elders in the first congregation, one of the elders said something that wasn't right. He asked me, in fact, to read out of a book, and I said, I'm disfellowshipped. I'm not allowed to have that book. And the other two elders said, yeah, he's right. But then the first elder turned to me and said, it's not your position to teach us. And it's like, really? Is that what you're going to do? And one time he called me up, and I had been still having some communication with my sons. This was, again, 12 years ago. And he called me up and he said, I needed to not talk to my sons anymore. And I said, you will not tell me to not talk to my sons. I'm sure that cost me more than a year of being disfellowshipped. I mean, it's all, guess what? It's a cult. It's all about control, right? They want to have it. They don't want you to have it. And if you exercise any autonomy or any attitude of having independent spirit, that's bad, right? That's how they determine if you're repentant or not. So I
So
kind of
you're in
went
the
off on a tangent there. I hope that was
No, it's
okay.
great. I think it's really great insight. And it leaves me wondering, when you were initially disfellowshipped, were you still in the position of elder, or had you stepped down from that role at that point? Because an elder being
So,
disfellowshipped is quite a significant thing as well, I think, considering that these are the people in the position to disfellowship or to disfellow other Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not
well,
funny,
that's
I
right.
understand. I think it's just a bit ironic in some ways.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's fine for you laughing. It is kind of funny. I'm glad you're getting a laugh at my expense. Um, yeah, so it was around 2002 or 2003 that I just could not ignore the red flags anymore. So when I said my wife a little earlier, I was talking about I've gotten remarried since I left the religion. My now ex-wife at the time, who had been raised as a witness, around 2002 or three, for some reason, and I've asked her about this and she has not answered. For some reason, she decided to share with me um, that there had been an Awake article. Awake is one of the magazines of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. They're known for the Watchtower and the Awake. That was published when she was about 10 years old, so 1969. And in that article, it said, young people, you will never get old. You'll never graduate high school. You'll never have a career. You won't ever die. And so that had a profound effect on her when she was 10. So that was 69. So she shared this with me about 2002. So what's that, about 34 years later, right? So she was in her middle 40s, right? So clearly none of those things were true. And now we're in our 60s. So she was getting old. She had left high school. Now she had a family and she had kids who were about to graduate high school. I don't know why she shared that article with me. When she first told me about it, I said, you must be wrong. They would never have said that. And so anyways, I got on the computer and found out in the Watchtower's own publications that sure enough, they had said that. And it was like, well, I had been accumulating a bunch of red flags that I had been ignoring. You mentioned cognitive dissonance before. That's a very powerful psychological phenomenon, and confirmation bias. And so it was, I could not ignore these things any longer. And so, again, this was a fuck, I'm in a cult moment. And so I had decided I was going to screw this, screw what the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society said about higher education. I decided to go back to college and pursue that education degree and get that teaching credential that I had wanted to do for 20 years. I did it. And so I continued to be an elder. I thought maybe I could find some way to get my whole family out of the cult intact. And I proceeded to do this again. This went on for about 6 or 7 years. Then I thought, well, maybe I can get my children out with me, because it was evident my ex-wife was never going to leave. I don't think she believes it either, but she's just so entrenched. It's all she's ever known. It's her whole family. And then I finally thought, well, maybe I can leave and somehow have a relationship with my kids. And maybe, it's like someone escaping a prison and then going back and rescuing them. So these were sort of naive fantasies I had that never came to fruition. The only part that happened was I left. And I sort of made a mess of that. There's no really good way to leave a cult. There's probably better ways and worse ways. But I had a short conversation with my younger son, Connor, about 6 months ago, the one who listened to the podcast. And he very angrily kind of asked me about some of these things. And I said, it's true, Connor, I could have done things differently. And I've run 1,000 scenarios in my mind since. And maybe some of them would have been easier for you and your brother to accept than others, but every single one of them ends up with this result. I'm out of that religion because I don't believe in it anymore. It's not true. It's a cult. And I know you don't like hearing that, but he'd heard the podcast, so he knew I believe that. So there's no point in beating around the bush here. I don't believe that. And since your mother wouldn't leave it, we're not together anymore. So every scenario I've ever run ends up the same with that. So yeah, I was disfellowshipped in 2009. I was serving as an elder, and here's an irony. A few months before any of that happened, at one of our elder meetings, we got a letter from the governing body, the top leadership group of the organization, and it was very strongly saying that any appointed man as an elder or a ministerial servant or a thing they call a pioneer who went to university or even spoke encouragingly about it would lose their position of authority. And so I had just, this must have been more like 2007, so maybe 2 years before, not a couple of months before I left. I had just gotten my degree like a few months before. And I'm sitting there shocked. And so I said, in a rare moment of outspokenness on this subject in front of my fellow elders at the time, I said, I have a real problem with this. If that letter had been read like 6 months or 9 months ago, I would have been in the awkward position of not continuing my bachelor's degree, which was only a month or two away. But now that it's a few months afterwards, it's like somehow I slipped under the wire, and they're like, oh no, they're not talking about you. And it's like, it didn't say everybody except for Daniel O'Brien in that letter. That was really, really, really hard for me. The official leadership has sort of swung like a pendulum. They've never endorsed or encouraged higher education, but sometimes they're much more adamant about thou shalt not do this. And other times it's like, well, if you can do it but not make a big deal about it, it's okay. So I went back to school when it was, if you can do it and not make a big deal about it, it's okay. But that swung the other way at the end. That being said, when my ex and I finally split, one of the last conversations we ever had, when in my mind it was like, we're done. We had not had an intimate relationship in 6 or 7 years. She's like, well, can't we try again? And I said, no, it's just too late. It's been too long. And I said, think about what happened. And in a rare moment of self-awareness on her part, she said, when I decided to return to university, she couldn't support that. And she admitted that she withdrew from me. And I said, right, that was 6 or 7 years ago. You made the decision to withdraw from me. You chose the religion over me. You chose the religion over us. So you're blaming me. I get that, because it's easier to blame me. But you chose this cult over me and over us. And the cult destroyed our family.
We recently did an episode together alongside Erica Bourneman when we went on Stephen Mather's show, which was then called What Should I Think About, and is now renamed Cult Hackers. And that episode is available for anybody to listen to today, where we discussed the recent International Cultic Studies Association conference, which you spoke at, which Stephen spoke at, which Erica won an award at for her memoir, Mission of Malice. So that was a great conversation. And it was in that conversation that we spoke about, well, I had learned this from watching your ICSA panel, that one of your sons actually lives just down the road from you, and you have not been able to have a relationship with him for all of this time. And I think that that's quite a significant thing to point out for listeners, that this shunning policy that exists, it's very real, because you will drive past his house every single day and there's no opportunity there for you to speak with him, to meet his wife, or be a part of his family. And I think that on the basis of religious practice it's one of the most destructive parts of high demand religious groups, this weaponizing of family members, and really the most powerful way to keep people in these groups, I think.
Yep, shunning. Someone called it the shun gun. That's why they do it. It's the threat of if you disobey whatever, we will ostracize you. Yes, my older son lives about a mile from me, and it's not every day, but it's at least a couple of times a week I will drive by, and they have a big, beautiful jacaranda tree in their backyard. Whenever I drive by, I honk the horn twice. Beep, beep. That was always a signal when we were together as a family that if someone left before they would pull out of the driveway, they would honk the horn twice, just kind of a quick you'd think after 13 years, you'd think after 13 years, this would be easier. And actually, this is easier. Yeah, be a quick little hunk of the horn. So I drive by there a couple times a week. One time a few years ago, I did actually knock on his door. That did not go well. Yeah, he threatened to call the police on me, and I said, "Look, I don't want to create a problem here. I came here to see if there's any chance that we could reconcile." And he got kind of physically threatening. And obviously I didn't want to get in a physical altercation with my son. But as I was walking away, and I said, "I'm leaving, so just stay there." I said, out of curiosity, if you call the police, what are you going to tell them? My father's on my porch telling me he loves me. Come arrest him. It's some next level fucked up shit. I've never met his wife. They've been married 7 years. They just celebrated their 7th anniversary. Someone asked me if they have kids. I said, I don't know. Nobody I know that nobody I know can talk to them. They've even extended the shunning to other family members who were never witnesses in an attempt to, I guess, isolate or insulate in the information flow. And the people who don't know also won't talk to me, or the people who do know or would know also won't talk to me. So my other son, the younger one, who I mentioned, we had a brief conversation a few months ago because of a family business thing. It wasn't a social call. Someone had told me that they had heard he got married. I asked him about that, and he refused to answer me. They also said that they'd heard he had moved. I asked him about that, and he refused to answer me. So, yeah, this shunning is it's totally real. So the psychologist David Myers in the textbook we use at my high school, there's a quote in there about ostracism and shunning. So as human beings, we have such a powerful need to belong. David Myers says, because of our human desire for connection, solitary confinement is, with the exception of torture, the worst form of punishment. So I've never undergone physical torture. I can't imagine that's something anybody would want to go through. It's got to be horrible. But that physical torture would have a finite time, and it would be over, assuming it didn't kill you. As I've experienced, and as many other people have experienced in all kinds of cults, this shunning can go on for years or a lifetime. So I know people who have never talked to their family members again, and they hear sometimes years later, "Oh, your father died, or your mother, or your sister, your brother," and they don't even know. They didn't even know. A friend of mine who had been raised as a witness and who left before I did, he called it a crime against humanity. When I first heard that, I thought he was being a little melodramatic, but I've come to appreciate that it's true. It's totally true.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series. In the third and final part, we will discuss the difficulty in rebuilding an entire life outside of the Jehovah's Witnesses Watchtower organisation. To get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.